So we have a game at our house, and I thought the kids might be interested in this, particularly here this morning. We have a game at our house that is a mystery game. It has a stack of cards that are full of, like, you can't see what is on the card other than all these just red dots on it. And it's kind of confusing. The game's called 30-Second Mysteries. And you're trying to figure out the solution to a specific mystery that is described on the back of the card. But it also comes with this red filter. And when you look at the card through that red filter, all of a sudden, all the noise of the dots, the busy look of these red dots just disappear. And then you can actually see what the solution is. You can see what the answer is. You can see what the solution to the mystery actually is. The mystery is solved. And we're going to talk this morning about how, both in looking back on our life and looking ahead, our experience, our thoughts, our view on what is in our past and what is ahead for us can be completely different when we look at it through something specific. And kids, just to let you know, if you can tell your parents after church what that thing is that changes everything, when you look through it, they've got something special for you. I can't tell you what it is, but they have something special for you. All right? Sorry, parents. So this morning, we're talking about looking at everything with the eyes of faith. Looking at everything with the eyes of faith. That's, kids, that's not exactly what it is yet. Just to tell you. You got to listen for it. We'll see how Joseph and his father Jacob, looked at situations that we experience too. Bad past experiences and death. None of us have experienced death yet. I don't think anybody here yet has experienced that, but we all will. And hopefully we can learn to look with eyes of faith as they did. We've come a long way in our study of Joseph, right? This is our last sermon on the life of Joseph. Our main character went from being the second youngest, who was considered a pest by his brothers, to being the second ruler of Egypt, who provided for the survival of his whole family. God made it known that Joseph would be the one directing and providing for his family, but ultimately God made it known that God would be directing this rescue mission through his agent, Joseph. He made this clear by giving Joseph dreams of his family bowing down to him at some point in the future. And we actually saw over the study of this life of Joseph, this prophetic picture played out multiple times in the recent chapters that we looked at. In fact, we'll see once more this morning in the last chapter of Genesis, Joseph's brothers bowing down to him in fulfillment of this dream. And we should keep in mind that from the very beginning, God was calling his shot. He was saying, I am going to be in charge of all these events and bring them to this point. But before then, we'll observe the passing of the last patriarch of the people of Israel. So we turn to the last verses of Genesis 49, actually, here, at verse 28. And we read these words. This, if you remember from last week, Jacob was blessing and predicting for his 12 sons, and also who would become the 12 tribes of Israel, what would come in the future. And so we come to that in verse 28. All these are the 12 tribes of Israel. This is what their father said to them as he blessed them, blessing each with the blessing suitable to him. And that was the close of that scene from last week. Then he commanded them and said to them, I am to be gathered to my people, Bury me with my father in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite, in the cave that is in the field of Machpelah, to the east of Mamre, in the land of Canaan, which Abraham bought with the field of Ephron the Hittite to possess as a burial place. There they buried Abraham and Sarah his wife. There they buried Isaac and Rebekah his wife, and there I buried Leah. The field and the cave that is the field and the cave that is in it were bought from the Hittites. These little details. When Jacob finished commanding his sons, he drew up his feet into the bed and breathed his last and was gathered to his people. Then Joseph fell on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. So the physicians embalmed Israel. Yeah, kids, so they made him a mummy. All right, so he's in Egypt. That's what the Egyptians do. 40 days were required for it, for that was how many are required for embalming. So there you know that. And the Egyptians wept for him 70 days. And when the days of weeping for him were past, Joseph spoke to the household of Pharaoh, saying, Now if I have found favor in your eyes, please speak in the ears of Pharaoh, saying, My father made me swear, saying, I am about to die in my tomb that I hewn out for myself in the land of Canaan. There you shall bury me. Now therefore let me, please, go up and bury my father. Then I will return. And Pharaoh answered, Go up and bury your father, as he made you swear. So Joseph went up to bury his father. With him went up all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his household, and all the elders of the land of Egypt. I mean, this is a big entourage of important people from Egypt, as well as all the household of Joseph, his brothers, and his father's household. Only their children, their flocks, and their herds were left in the land of Goshen. And there went up with him both chariots and horsemen. It was a very great company. When they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond the Jordans, they lamented there with a very great and grievous lamentation. And he made a mourning for his father 7 days. When the inhabitants of the land of the Canaanites saw the mourning on the threshing floor of Atad, they said, This is a grievous mourning by the Egyptians. Therefore the place was named Abel Mizraim. It is beyond the Jordan. Can you imagine if we saw somebody coming from, I don't know, Texas, and with this big of an entourage, and they went over to Indian Mound Cemetery, and they were there for a week mourning over this? It would be definitely the talk of the town, if not the state, for sure. And then we read in verse 12, Thus the sons did for him as he commanded them. For his sons carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave of the field of Machpelah to the east of Mamre, which Abraham bought with the field from Ephron the Hittite to possess as a burial place. Keep in mind here, this is a book of history. So details are super important. The more details that are given from this book, written hundreds and thousands of years earlier for the people that even before Christ, as they're reading this, that they could go there and say, yep, there's the grave. There's the burial place. These are significant details, especially for a book of history, even though they don't seem necessarily significant for us. So where did I leave off? After he had buried his father, Joseph returned to Egypt with his brothers and all who had gone up with him to bury his father. So the next verses tell of Joseph's brothers' fear. They have a fear of what's going to happen after their father Jacob has died. So we pick back up in verse 15. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, It may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil that we did to him. Older kids, do you ever worry about this? Good. You shouldn't have to. So they sent a message to Joseph saying, "Your father gave this command before he died. Say to Joseph, please forgive the transgressions of your brothers and their sin, because they did evil to you. And now please forgive the transgressions of the servants of the God of your father." So with the death of their father, Joseph's brothers, they get nervous here, more than a little nervous, that Joseph might have been nursing a grudge. They got scared that Joseph was being nice to them out of reverence for their father, Jacob. Now that Jacob is dead, they're worried that Joseph might be planning to take vengeance on them, because they did some pretty horrible things to their brother Joseph that set his life on a very different path than it would have been. The general consensus here is that Joseph's brothers made up this story. So they're telling a lie about Jacob's final wish that Joseph would forgive his brothers. The fact is that this came as a message to Joseph. It kind of highlights how concerned they were about the deep-seated anger Joseph might have been harboring against them. They had to send a message to him with this request, or the supposed request from their father on his deathbed. And we pick back up that Joseph wept when they spoke to him. His brothers also came and fell down before him and said, "Behold, we are your servants." Once again, we see the fulfillment of Joseph's dream at the very beginning of the story of his life. God is saying, "I'm in all of this." But Joseph said to them, "Do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear. I will provide for you and your little ones." Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. We're not quite sure why Joseph wept as he did. There's probably a lot of reasons. It might have been that he regrets that his brothers would have been thinking such dark thoughts about him. It may be that he feels for his brothers' fear that they might have been feeling at that time. It may be that he's overcome by the significance of this moment and what a privilege it is for him to tell them what he has to say. The theme of verse 20 should seem familiar to us, as it's been our theme for this series, and our theme has been based on Joseph's response here. What you meant for evil against me, God meant it for good. This morning we're going to be unpacking these ideas in a little greater detail. But first we'll get to the end of the book of Genesis here, where we read verse 22. So Joseph remained in Egypt, he and his father's house. Joseph lived 110 years. And Joseph saw Ephraim's children to the third generation. The children also of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were counted as Joseph's as well. And Joseph said to his brothers, "I am about to die, but God will visit you and bring you up out of this land to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob." Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, "God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here." So Joseph died, being 110 years old. They embalmed him, and he was put into a coffin in Egypt. Yeah, so they made Joseph a mummy too, kids, if you can picture that. So these verses, as I mentioned, these close the book of Genesis. It's been said that the book of Genesis opens with an immortal man being placed into the perfect land, the Garden of Eden. That's what the book of Genesis opens with. An immortal man, the man Adam, being placed into the perfect Garden of Eden. And it closes with a mortal man being placed into a coffin with the hope of returning to the promised land. The next book of the Bible opens 400 years later, describing the situation 400 years later with the people of Israel enslaved and crying for deliverance. And so we'll begin their exodus from Egypt back to the promised land as a nation of at least 3 million people. So we turn to learn from these closing verses of Genesis and the life of Joseph. And first, from Joseph's conversation with his fearful brothers, I want to challenge you, when looking back, trust that God works toward his good purpose. When looking back on your life, trust that God works toward his good purpose. Joseph's brothers were worried that Joseph might stop providing for their needs. If you remember, Joseph, as the second ruler of Egypt, he was supplying everything that his family needed. And he was even worse than that, he could have done than just stopping supplying what they needed. They knew that they had seriously wronged their brother, and that he had held the cards, all the cards in their relationship. With a word, he could have hung them out to dry. He could have turned them into public enemies, not only them, but all of their children, all of their descendants. The source of Joseph's humility is key here. He recognized one thing: he is not in the place of God. He doesn't sit on the judgment seat and decide that they need to pay for their deeds, and neither do we. He calls out their past motivations for what they are. They did what they did to try to cause evil to him. They tried to harm him in an evil way. He recognized that they wanted to kill him or cause him to disappear. But he recognized also that God was at work in unmistakable ways. Joseph benefits in his perspective from an unavoidable truth. God used him in Egypt to save countless people and to keep his family alive and even thriving there, thriving more than they were in the land of Canaan. His statements are similar to what he told them back in Genesis 45, verses 7 and 8. He tells them back then, "And God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep you alive, and to keep alive for you many survivors. And it was not you who sent me here, but God." I mean, they threw him in a pit. They sold him to slave traders that would take him down to Egypt. They did all these things to him. But yet, we saw back there in Genesis 45 that he tells them, "It was not you who sent me here, but God." The question that Joseph asks is one that we should ask ourselves. The question is what that would serve us well when we're angry about how we've been treated. And I hope we'll think of it when we want to make others pay for what they've done. That same question: am I in the place of God? Am I in the place of God? Like Joseph, our faith can transform the way we think about and respond to people that have hurt us in the past. You know, all of us came into this world with our first experience being one of great disappointment, right? How would we describe our first bad experience here, right? How would we say this? I was in the place in my life where I had everything I needed. I was in the perfect environment. Everything I wanted was within reach, literally. I had no want of food or comfort. My favorite activity which is water aerobics. I was able to do freely until things started getting a little tight, right? Then one day, with no warning, I was tossed out into the coldest, loudest place I had ever experienced. My food supply got cut off, literally, and then I'm pretty sure somebody slapped me on the backside. I know this lighthearted example of us coming into the world, it doesn't compare with the evil that some of you have experienced from other people. But I don't think that any of us were sold into slavery like Joseph was, although that happens even today. While Joseph was able to see the great good that God intended from these evil actions, we have to look at our situations in the past through eyes of faith. We have to apply the truth that God causes all things to work together for the good of his children, for his glory and our good. We look at that with faith to see it. Is there an experience in your past that makes you mad when you think about the way that you were treated? Can you trust that God allowed it to take place for his good purposes? I don't say that lightly. Can you forgive those who have hurt you, knowing in faith that God was at work even in their mistreatment of you? Even though something is grieving and painful for us, this does not mean that God was not involved or that he was not grieved also. God can allow something to happen to us that grieves him terribly. If you have a hard time believing that God could allow something to take place, even though it grieves him, would you think the same about his sacrifice of his son? Something horrible that he allowed to take place to someone he couldn't love anymore, that grieved him terribly. Isaiah 53:10 tells us, it was the will of the Lord to crush Jesus. And we know that it was only through the sacrifice of Jesus that God could be glorified in our salvation. You know, we have this saying, the juice has to be worth the squeeze, right? That means to have to squeeze that fruit, you got to be getting enough juice to make it worth it. The glory juice, if you will, that God squeezes out of us is often only through suffering. And we trust him that it's worth it. And there's qualities that God squeezes into us only through suffering. Walk in faith and look back on painful experiences, trusting that God works toward his good purposes in them. He was at work for his good purposes in them. Our passage also gives us examples of faith looking forward. And from it, I want to challenge you here this morning. When looking ahead, specifically, looking ahead toward death, that we all have to look ahead toward. When looking ahead, trust that God will keep his promises. The death of Jacob and Joseph are described in our passage here this morning, both of them. And it seems insignificant other than the fact that Jacob is the last, as I mentioned, of the Hebrew patriarchs. But the significance is also found in the faith that both of these men have, that God will keep his promises. So first let's look at Jacob here. Jacob trusted that God would keep his promises. And we see that in how he tells them where to bury his body. As I said before, he's near the end of his life. Jacob could have asked here for a pyramid or one of those sphinx things to be built for him. I mean, his family was sitting pretty. His son was the second ruler of Egypt. He could have been like, you know what? There was that promised land that God told me about, but this looks pretty promising to me. But instead, his eyes are still set on the promises of God for his people. He commanded his sons to take his body back to the promised land. In Genesis 23, Abraham dies in the land that was promised to him and his descendants. This is Jacob's family plot here that Abraham purchased for he and his descendants. And Jacob wants to be buried with his family members there. More importantly, Jacob is showing his stalwart faith and hope that God will keep his promise about this land. God had promised to give to the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob the land of Canaan and beyond that. And Jacob was looking in faith to that future day. He wanted to be buried where his future descendants would dwell. And he knew that in faith. You know, we don't hear anything about Joseph. As we turn to think about Joseph and his death here, we don't hear anything about him for the next 60 years. He basically goes from his 50s to all of a sudden he's 110. It's not that he's not doing anything significant during that time. Well, we can assume that he's working in the government of Egypt, as well as he's still known by the pharaohs, because we're told that that's what changed. We're told in Exodus 1, a pharaoh reigned that did not know Joseph. And everything changed. But he's doing plenty of significant things, but the book of Genesis is about God's plan for the world. And so we revisit here at the death of Joseph to pick up the fact of his faith that God was going to keep his promise to his people. I think a lack of information about Joseph at this point in his life tells us what God wants us to learn about from this chapter. Reconciliation, recognition of God's sovereignty, and hope for the future fulfillment of God's plan. Everything else God just skips over in Joseph's life. Similar to his father, Joseph makes a request on his deathbed. And we see that Joseph trusted that God would keep his promises as well. Joseph might have been anticipating what's coming for his people when he tells them, God will surely visit you. It's what the next book opens up about, the book of Exodus, as I've mentioned, where you can read in Exodus 1, verses 8 through 10, where it says, Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them. And from that point forward, the descendants of Jacob there in Egypt were enslaved for 400 years. This led to the children of Israel being enslaved for these 400 years from that point forward. But Joseph confidently tells his family, God will visit them and bring them out of this land to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And like his father, Jacob, Joseph makes his family swear that they will take his bones with them. Or I guess if he was, embalmed, I guess, he's like in some big coffin 400 years later, still wrapped up in, I don't know, I'm stuck on this mummy thing. Sorry. But so then, like his father Joseph, again, he makes them swear to take his bones with them. And in his final moments of dying, in faith, knowing that God would keep his promise to lead his people back to the promised land, that's why he makes them swear this. Hebrews 11 is known as the Hall of Faith. It gives us examples of Old Testament saints and how they walked by faith. And interestingly, last week's and this morning's passage contain the examples that Hebrews 11 gives for both the faith of Jacob and of Joseph. Everything that these people went through and all of their trust of God throughout their life, Hebrews 11 chooses from Jacob and from Joseph from these chapters. Both have to do with their faith that God would return his people to Canaan as he promised to do. We read in Hebrews 11, verses 21 through 22, By faith, Jacob, when dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, bowing in worship over the head of his staff. And by faith, Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave directions concerning his bones. As I mentioned last week, Jacob blessed his sons in faith as he spoke of how they would be tribes of a people in the land of Canaan, which God had promised to his people. And this morning, we're reading about how Joseph makes his family promise to take his bones with him as they return to that promised land. On the authority of the scriptures, in other words, what we're told here in Hebrews 11, we can say that Joseph is standing on faith, in faith on the promises of God. You know, one of my family's favorite movies is Napoleon Dynamite. All right. It's one of those movies you got to give it like a third watching, and then you're quoting it for the rest of your life. In the movie, there's this character, Uncle Rico, right? And he thinks he's really suave, but he's really not. And Uncle Rico is this humorously pitiful character who's living in the past. And when he's talking to his nephew Kip, sitting on the front stoop of the house, he starts reminiscing. And here's what he says. He says, back in '82, I used to be able to throw a pigskin a quarter of a mile. Kids, that's a football, right? He's claiming he could, back in his high school days, he could throw a football a quarter of a mile. And he goes on and he says, yeah, if coach had put me in the fourth quarter, we'd be state champions, no doubt. I mean, he's the backup quarterback. And he's basically saying, if the coach had just put me in to that one game, we wouldn't have been state champions. He says, no doubt in my mind. You better believe things would have been different. I'd have gone pro in a heartbeat. I'd be making millions of dollars and living in a big old mansion somewhere, soaking it up in a hot tub with my soulmate. You guys that have seen this movie can just picture that. Uncle Rico is a prime example of a person living in the past because his mind is stuck in the past. I heard recently that when people die, they'll either be looking back, so when they're on their deathbed, they'll either be looking back on the past longingly and regretfully, or they will be looking ahead with faith, like our brother Kurt, as Dan shared about here this morning. They'll either be looking back on the life that they wish they could turn back and wishing that they could turn back time, or they'll be looking ahead expectantly for what they're looking forward to on the other side of death. And this will affect how we age as well. We might look back on the short years that we have on this life, on this earth, and wish that we could live them again. Or we might look ahead expectantly on the long years of eternity that we have to spend with God and His people. Of course, the main difference in these perspectives is whether a person has trusted in the person and work of Christ for their eternal salvation. But even those of us who have our eternity secure as a part of God's family, we can be stuck in the past. We can sacrifice the joy that we should have looking ahead because we are believing that life is truly found in what the world has to offer here. We can lose that joy of looking ahead, even looking at the other side of death that people spend their lives trying to stay away from. What are some promises that you cling to when the future seems bleak? Let me just tell you this. If you know Christ as your Savior, the ultimate future is never bleak, but it can still seem bleak. If you can't name any of God's promises for your future, this might partly explain why you have worry in your heart or why the future does seem bleak. I hope that our time in God's Word here this morning has encouraged you to trust that God will keep His promises. But whether or not you enjoy that fact now has to do with how well you trust Him for that fact. And that you will glorify Him by looking ahead to eternity with joyful expectations. So, this filter here kind of represents how something that we can look at the past with, and we can look on the future with. And it would change both of them if we will just look at them through this. And what it represents is the work of Christ. The work of Christ. Because when I'm looking back on the past and the things that people have done to me, when I look at that through this filter, when I look at that through the work of Christ, I can look at that and realize what they have done has been paid for by the work of Christ on the cross. I don't have to hold that against them because it's been paid for. And when I look at the future and I look at it through the work of Christ, I can realize I've been paid for. My relationship with God has been paid for. He's my advocate. I don't have to worry about what's on the other side of death for me. I can look ahead of it with faith because I'm looking at it through the work of Christ.